Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. Firstly, we're extremely pleased to welcome you, Andrew Wood. Andrew really wants to mention that the work that he's done here is with some collaborators. Andrew has retired but continues as an adjunct professor at Swinburne University here in Melbourne. His area is biophysics, and he has an ongoing projects at Swinburne and with WHO. And he lives in West Gippsland and attends Warragul Anglican Church. So we welcome you, Andrew. Please come to the stage. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to talk about the results of group meetings that we had. There were 4 of us. We met online during 2021. This was to produce material for Nigel Chapman's book on conspiracy theories, and Nigel spoke earlier about that particular book. Thank you. Our discussions were a bit wider than just conspiracy theories. Were about how we deal with science denial in general, particularly among fellow Christians and with faith communities in general, noting that other religions seem to have similar problems. The 4 of us were from Queensland, New South Wales, the ACT and Victoria, and despite lockdowns we met online about 8 or 9 times. So these are the 4 points I want to cover. Why hostility? What works to build bridges? The idea of flick. Why science can get a bad name, and the need for forbearance within our faith communities. There are 2 books I want to highlight. The first one formed the background to some of our conclusions. The second one I've only recently become aware of, but has a lot of useful material which confirms much of our thinking. Here are the covers. So the one on the left is by an American philosopher, and the one on the right is from, I think, a couple of psychologists. So both of them are very recent, and they're both from good publishers. These weren't talking about Christian groups or faith groups in particular, but there were 1 or 2 interesting observations that they made about science denial in church settings. So here's a formal definition of science denial. It's an active pushing back on what science is bringing to bear on the way we live. Further, it's the rejection of basic concepts that are undisputed, well-supported parts of scientific consensus on a subject in favour of ideas that are radical, controversial, or fabricated. Climate change denial is an obvious example, but following the lockdown phase of COVID, the issue of vaccination requirement for working in certain areas was hot, with many choosing to quit their jobs rather than to submit to official health advice. My own area of radiation safety has seen angry protests over 5G rollout, and prior to that, in Victoria, the rollout of smart meters. This caused quite angry protests. Those who study risk perception emphasize that risk is a combination of actual quantifiable hazard and the outrage people feel over the way the risk is imposed uncontrollably. People rate these risks much more highly compared to risks that people feel that they take on voluntarily, for example, car driving. Risks that have an air of mystery about them, like unseen radiation, rank as much more risky than visible, knowable or familiar risks, like driving through floodwaters, for example, which is actually much more risky. In our group, we shared stories about science denial among church groups. For example, I shared about a person that I know who, whenever I broach a particular science topic, shakes his head and hints that I am naive and deluded, whereas he and his internet friends know the truth. Another of us shared about relatives who regularly put up the shutters when certain science-related topics came up and actually refused to see them. That group member shared that more recently, by understanding the background of alienation and disappointment, effective contact has been restored. So really understanding where people are coming from. There are particular features of Christian communities which we identified as leading to a deep distrust about particular scientific advances being amplified. Of course, there are advances which cause disquiet in most of us, but we're thinking here for advances that, like vaccination or climate change mitigation, which are designed for the general good of humankind and life in general. We noted an opinion piece by Adam Cottrell and noted some observations of our own. Now, I think Adam Cottrell is associated with a church in Melbourne, but I forget which one. So he wrote a piece for the ABC. So there's a tendency among some to place feelings above factual evidence, erroneously equating feelings with faith. Such people are often unassailable, with appeals to factual evidence being branded as a lack of faith. And some may even go as far as to say, God has told me about a certain thing. There's a suspicion of elites, including those with specialist scientific knowledge, as being counter to the general elevation of the poor and downtrodden in the New Testament. But not many doesn't mean not any. But the arrogance of some atheistic elites certainly doesn't help. This is not restricted to faith groups, but a significant proportion of the population in wealthy countries seem to distrust large corporations such as drug companies, well, I guess COVID has changed this to an extent, and software companies like Microsoft, for example. Conspiracy theories often owe their origin to suspicions of large organizations, like, for example, the US military. Some faith groups like things to be black and white with plain, yes/no answers. The ambiguities and uncertainties that scientists are fairly comfortable with seem unsatisfactory to the wider public, who feel that science is failing to deliver. Some of the distrust stems from personal situations of disappointment or perceived injustice. Scientists in general can seem smug, uncaring, and self-serving. I'll be coming back to this in just a moment. But this is an example from Papua New Guinea, which has a high percentage of general evangelical Christians, but where there is a poor vaccine uptake. So the uptake rate in Papua New Guinea is 3.3% fully vaccinated, compared to 85% fully vaccinated in Australia. As the writer says, the view is the vaccine as a vehicle for the much larger forces of global and cosmic tyranny. According to Sinatra and Hoffer, the book I was mentioning earlier, there are a number of factors in general leading to science denial. Here are some. Many people prefer to stay ignorant of detailed science, feeling it doesn't really impact on them. They often say, I was never very good at physics or something, as an excuse, meaning that don't try to tell me anything more. Actually, it isn't entirely their fault. Some scientists are overly smug and seem intent on impressing with their cleverness. The media, on the other hand, want to dumb down and trivialize to focus on the amusing or the sensational, since that's what sells the paper or the ads. people think that they control what they look at on the internet, on social media. In fact, they select things that confirm presuppositions and enter alliances with similar-minded people. The algorithms, and somebody was talking about this earlier, recognize these biases and find further links to bolster these convictions. Rather than seeking alternative viewpoints or fact-checking, both of which is time-consuming, we all tend to take what is fed to us. In an excellent book on the death of expertise, Tom Nichols laments the way that people, after half an hour of web browsing, feel that they can dismiss the considered opinions of those who have spent decades devoted to a single topic. Here's another quote from his book. All voices, even the most ridiculous, demand to be taken with equal seriousness, and any claim to the contrary is dismissed as undemocratic elitism. So that's the situation. But what can we do to redress things? In general first, and then in church and church group settings secondly. Invoking science as a special authority, like in the name of the Lord in biblical settings, is not a good approach. Neither is saying, well, let me set you straight on what the science tells us. There should be respect and warmth, rather than you just listen to what I tell you. Going back to the way that science should be communicated to the general public, graphs and tables are far more effective than screeds of learned talk. We'll come on to devious strategies in a moment. But the scientific method is poorly understood and should perhaps be explained, especially peer review and methods of reaching consensus in science. Inoculation is mentioned in Nigel Chapman's book, and I'm sure there is merit in this idea, but it was difficult for us to get our heads around what is meant by a weakened version of misleading information. We certainly agree that warning about the consequent dangers of accepting conspiracy theories is important, but it is hard to stay ahead of the game. FLIC. So FLIC stands for the following: fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theory belief. The idea first appeared in a blog in 2007, but has appeared subsequently in more substantial publications. These are the strategies that science deniers will use to bolster their position. Recognizing these elements for what they are is an effective way to try to rebut in a non-heated and respectful way. So, fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, and cherry-picking conspiracy theory belief. Now, the heading says scientists behaving badly. And it mentions that there are several Nature papers about this topic that have appeared recently. So those of us who are practicing scientists know that we're not lily-white or perfect, and this just means we have to be careful when talking about the power of scientific consensus. The prestige journal Nature has had a series of articles and editorials in recent years about significant shortcomings in the way science is done and recommendations for getting its house in order. Many of my colleagues complain that doing science has become a game, underfunded, pressurized, and precarious. Little wonder that some scientists try to take shortcuts, for example, rushing to print and then later having to retract. So I get a weekly bulletin of retracted papers. There's an organisation that does that, keeps track of retractions. So a number of questionable practices, but things like lack of funding, it's particularly so younger science in particular tend to resort to desperate measures to maintain their positions, since their positions are often short-term contracts. Time pressures lead to poor supervision and checking by senior scientists, and cherry-picking of statistical significant results is not restricted to science deniers. It happens a lot. So we need to be humble in our discussions with science deniers. I have to say that in the last few years, the Act has been cleared up considerably due to the recognition of deficiencies and recalibration of the way that science is done. And there's general affirmation of the robustness of peer review and the methods of reaching consensus. So these scientists behaving badly, the consensus process seems to iron those out.
Andrew, about 4 minutes.
Thank you, that's fine. Almost there. Turning specifically to fellow Christians, scientists need to humbly confess their collective faults. They should not turn their backs on science deniers. They're still family if they declare faith. And the response to aggression and shouting is not to give back the same, but to allow the fruit of the Spirit to be manifest. Rather than just dismissing out of hand, we should be prepared to find out more and be familiar with the particular logical fallacy. The next is most important. Belonging to a science denier or a conspiracy theory community, even if virtual, gives a sense of identity and belonging. And if a person is persuaded to leave that community, there needs to be another welcoming and supportive community, like a Bible study group, etc., for them to become part of and to take over from the previous community. There will be rebuffs, but that's not a reason to sever relationships. We need to be in the long haul. So there are a number of settings that we discussed in which respectful dialogue can take place. Much of what we as a group discussed was in relation to person-to-person interactions in home groups or church gatherings. But we also talked about the roles of those in leadership roles could have, noting a general tendency to avoid such controversies in sermons, etc. Scientists, who are Christians, have a role to provide good, concise information to pastors and ministers. Overtures could also perhaps be made to local school teachers or youth leaders to investigate opportunities for qualified scientists to speak. We talked about public meetings, but these need to be treated with caution, because certainly in my experience, they can easily degenerate into shouting matches. It depends very much on the circumstances as to whether to engage in those. And finally, here is a prayer from the Anglican Prayer Book for Australia, headed in times of conflict. It's just part of it, but I'll leave it on the screen for us to ponder. Thank you.
Well, I think we'll go through till 5 p.m, given we had a few tech issues, etc. Andrew, there's a number of questions that have come through. The first one, it says, is it really fair to include anti-GMO and anti-vaxxers as science deniers? Such people, perhaps some of these people, they don't deny the science, they just don't think it should be done.
Right, yes. I mean, that's an important question. I think when there's a question about the general good of the community, so if GMOs are a way of feeding large populations, then I think that scientists who are Christians should perhaps say that there's a good justification for accepting these as technologies to pursue, rather than, I mean, certainly there are arguments both ways.
And perhaps one of the problems might be that it's just a blanket, all GMO is bad or all GMO is good.
Well, I think it's because anti-GMO people tend to demonstrate, or that they engage in public meetings and the like.
Then we've got a question that says, I spoke at a Christian primary school fielding questions on how old is the Earth. The teacher who invited me, of course, said, of course, we know the Earth is 6,000 years old. How would you suggest reacting in this situation, neither wanting to undermine the teacher nor misinform the students?
Well, that's a really hard question. I know that in my own church, when we were talking about a particular book, everybody in the group was very surprised when I said, well, I accept evolution and that the Earth is old, etc. So I think in church groups, there's a kind of an expectation that people have a certain view, including young Earth, etc. I think what one can say, well, that's one view, that others have a view that things are much older, and there's some good evidence that it is much older. I think, one has to respect that people have a seriously held belief that we're young, and I think that if it's a teacher, you would have to avoid making him feel embarrassed. So,
but also politely hold up the science, I guess.
Yeah.
Then we have a question, doesn't your message boil down to improving the presentation of ideas in order to communicate effectively to specific audiences?
I think that is true. I think, as I said, science communicators, if they're good, they're very, very good. But if they're not, the message can be very confusing and puts people off. So I guess it depends really on the situation that one is, whether it's a church group or a larger group, in the selection of good speakers who you kind of know would be good for that audience. But I mean, scientists in general aren't taught how to communicate to the general world. They're taught to communicate to each other, but some of them are very good at it.
Look, Andrew, there was one more question. We'll leave it. Thanks so much for terrific talk. Thank you.